Hello and welcome to another Sagely Health webinar. Today is November 1st, 2022. We have the Halloween hangover is over and we are into November. I am joined as always by Dr. Jason Sager, CEO and founder of Sagely Health. Hi, Jason.
Hey, Jeremy. Good to see
you.
you.
Get any trick-or-treating in?
Oh, yeah. Well, we did a lot of passing out of the sweets. So,
Nice.
And got a little bit of a sugar rush.
Yeah. Good. So, as we planned, today we're going to be talking about the latest advances in cancer treatment. And there's kind of a bunch of interest in this topic because kind of everyone kind of hears a lot of the news about, things that are happening and kind of know that clinical trials are going on. So it's kind of like somewhat looking over the hill, kind of what's coming. And then also I think the takeaway from today might be a lot of that might be available today for people. So let me just start by asking you, what are some things that are happening in cancer treatment that you get excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of efforts being made in cancer on a day-to-day basis and a year-to-year basis. We know from sites like clinicaltrials.gov, which is the government registry for all clinical trials, which represent in the United States most of the innovative attempts, or official innovative attempts that are ongoing. We know that there are upwards of about 13,000 trials for cancer. And so, as such, it is something that we like to tell patients about and bring their attention to. The issue is that for most patients, it's very hard for them to actually assess which innovative therapies are the right ones for them. And we'll show you today a little bit about sort of how we look at this. But there's definitely a lot of innovative approaches, and there's new breakthroughs coming out all the time. And so assessing which therapies are likely to be the breakthroughs and getting them to the cancer patients today, even when they're not official, but sort of they are officially standard therapy, but ahead of that, is really what we do best and what we advise cancer patients to access.
Absolutely. So one of the areas that a lot of people do ask about is immunotherapy, and I know that's kind of a wide range of things. But could we talk a little bit about, we've talked about it before. Immunotherapy is kind of trying to get your immune system active in the fight against your cancer. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what's going on in immunotherapy and kind of is it only in certain cancer types? Is it kind of going and moving from other cancer types?
Yeah. And it's a great question, and from my perspective, it is one of the most recent breakthroughs in terms of, and I'd say it's even more than a breakthrough. It's a shift in the way that we're approaching cancer treatments today, and it's a great example of how new breakthroughs can be discovered, brought to patients, and then turned into standard therapies, and then innovated on top of that. And so from my perspective, immunotherapy, which is basically getting the patient's body to attack the immune system of the body, to attack the cancer, much like it might attack a bacteria or a virus that was infecting someone, getting it to recognize that, hey, this is not supposed to belong. And here's a way that we can get it to attack that cancer and get rid of it. That is a lot about where I think science has been going, and the real hope that one day the immune system will be able to do what our chemicals, our chemotherapies have not been able to do so far, which is basically to bring cures for cancer. I think that from an immunotherapy perspective, this story started about 10 to 15 years ago. And, I've heard a lot about sort of how it came about. And much like many of the discoveries, it was somewhat serendipitous. There were some hints for a long time that the body can be sort of, tweaked or excited in a way. And rarely the body can by itself find cancers and kill them and get rid of them in very specific types of cancer. So renal cell carcinoma had a little bit of this. melanoma had a little bit of this. But again, about 10 to 15 years ago, there was a discovery made in a protein called PD-1, and and on the tumor cell, it's called PD-L1. And basically, this is a communication between the immune system and the tumor cell. And for a long time, it was always hypothesized that the tumors were doing something to hide from the immune system, to kind of cloak itself so it looks invisible to the immune system. But we never had a handle on what that protein was. Well, when PD-1 and PD-L1 were found, now all of a sudden we realized what that cloaking device was. And then you could then create an antibody that would basically gum it up so that it couldn't communicate and thus couldn't hide any longer, sort of, deactivate the cloaking device. Now all of a sudden, certain tumors which had some propensity to have an immune response, now all of a sudden we're having not a rare immune response, but a regular immune response. And so the specific case was in melanoma. And the fact is that today, both PD-1, PD-L1, and CTLA-4 inhibitors are all approved. And we went from basically someone with metastatic disease having a 90% chance of basically succumbing to their cancer, dying from their cancer within a year, to now a 50% cure, right? And again, for the other folks, the 50% that are not, they're still benefiting from these medicines. And again, science and medicine is continuing to innovate on top of those. What else can we add to excite the immune system even further? But gosh, 50% is a heck of a lot better than 0 or 10. And so it really has created a breakthrough in the specific area of melanoma, also renal cell carcinoma. And now we ask the question, well, can we bring it to others? And in some way, shape, or form, it's now approved in lung cancer, in bladder cancer, in head and neck cancer. And it's continuing to grow and expand. So sometimes as a one monotherapy, sometimes and more likely as a combination, 2 or more therapies being combined together. And the approaches are individualized based on those cancer types, as well as sort of the molecular characteristics, sort of the gene characteristics of the tumor. And so, part of this is understanding the tumor and what makes it tick. We do that with next-gen tumor sequencing. And some of this is bringing some of those innovative therapies, such as the immunotherapies, to the table and combining them in a way that really benefits and creates the best possible outcome for patients.
So, if I understand this right, your cancer type, they might have an immunotherapy drug like pembrolizumab, or the brand name is Keytruda, and that might have shown, a good response in a certain proportion of cancer patients, and that's a whole body treatment. That's not like a surgery or radiation. This is this is something that's available and it is for people who are metastatic, where the cancer is actually spread, and so the whole body can be involved. And then you said about the targeting. So is it kind of not just based on the cancer type, but some people are kind of a better candidate for this type of treatment than others?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it could be based on their tumor type, which is the where it originated from. Melanoma happens usually from the skin. Interestingly and unfortunately, if it came from the uvea, which is part of the eye, it generally has not shown response to these immunotherapies. So there's something specific to melanoma arising from the skin, and it may have been from the years of sun damage and that sort of thing, that creates the right sort of response for the immunotherapy to work. There are other cancer types that we've tried the same sort of therapies in, and it hasn't shown as much. And then there's even beyond that, specific patients who are more likely to respond to these inhibitors than others. One of them came out recently, and we had a webinar about the New York Times article about rectal cancer. But it wasn't really about rectal cancer. It was about a subset of cancer called MSI high. We know that by sequencing and getting that genetic analysis of a tumor, that next-gen sequencing that we're promoting and encouraging all of our patients to get from their doctor. But that finding of what's called MSI high means that that proportion of patients, and it may not, I think in rectal cancer it was like 10%, something like this. Those patients are now going to be expected to respond amazingly well to immunotherapy. So out of that study, we saw that patients almost unbelievably were coming out with, tremendous success. Tumors were disappearing. Surgeries that they were expecting to have were then canceled because they didn't have anything to take out anymore. And so those are the sorts of situations that we love to harness on behalf of cancer patients. But it really starts with both understanding sort of what's out there and what can be brought to patients, as well as analyzing and creating that personal care that can be provided on the basis of that individual patient's tumor.
Yeah, just a quick side note to anyone who hasn't seen any of our previous webinars talking about next-gen sequencing. What this is a diagnostic test that's done from a sample of the tumor material that's usually taken out when you're diagnosed. You may have a biopsy that is usable. That is sent to a company that will then analyze it and then return to you and your doctors a report that talks about the specific mutations that are in your cancer. So if anyone's kind of confused, what is next-gen sequencing? It's basically a diagnostic report, and not everyone's getting it to we believe that we'll get to the point where everyone will get it as part of the regular care, because it does help you personalize your care. It is available. If anyone has questions, please visit our website, contact us. We're happy to help guide you towards getting that test, and we have some materials about how to do that.
Yeah. And you're right. You said this a little bit earlier, that this is a systemic therapy, so it's going all over the body, and thus able to sort of clean up cells that we can't see. And there's a lot that we can't see that's going on microscopically. That being said, it is something that is not brought to necessarily all patients today. Like everything else, all medication have side effects, and this immunotherapy does have a risk of creating overexuberance, immune systems that could wind up attacking itself, in the body. So rarely, like 2% or 3% of the time, that immune system may attack the colon. Again, there's lots of bacteria in the colon, so it's not a huge surprise. Could cause some colitis. Likewise, the lungs. It could attack the lungs. In these sorts of rare situations, there are steroids or medicines that can be used to basically knock out that immune response. We're still learning, and we see that patients who have this and get the steroids to knock out the immune response are still benefiting in terms of their anti-melanoma response. So again, there's a lot that we don't understand about this system that we're still learning about. But what we know is that, that if you have a very curable situation, a low risk situation where you might have melanoma just right here on the skin, the surface of the skin, and they can go in and basically shell that out without having to do anything systemically, then you probably don't need immunotherapy. Right. However, again, you get into those gray zones where, again, in that Memorial Sloan Kettering study with rectal cancer, the expectation is that those patients were going to go for surgery. And this was done because they wanted to give the surgical, the surgeon an opportunity to deal with a smaller tumor. So why not shrink it before going in and taking it out? To their great surprise, some of those tumors completely disappeared, and then the surgery was canceled. So again, over time, we do bring these therapies to more and more wider audiences, but they oftentimes generally start with the metastatic situation where the tumor is spread beyond where it started from and might be found, let's say if it's in melanoma, it might be found in the lungs, it might be found in the liver, it might be found in other areas. But, certainly, we use all of this to try to find what's the best possible therapy. And what's nice about the immunotherapy is that, even before it was considered standard in melanoma, it had been used for years and years in clinical trials. And so patients who were able to access it before it was standard, including former President Jimmy Carter, they benefited from this. And, I don't believe that he would be alive today if not for the advent of this immunotherapy, PD-1 therapy, specifically pembrolizumab, nivolumab, and others that have been approved. And so, accessing these things ahead of them becoming standard is something that we can bring to patients today.
Excellent. So I want to ask specifically about, I believe it is a type of immunotherapy, which is something called CAR T therapy. That's come up a lot. I see a lot of posts about that. I get some questions about that. So I know it's a relatively complicated thing, but could you explain a little bit about what CAR T therapy is?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we talked about a little bit before about how the immune system can be educated to see the tumor.
Right.
In the case of melanoma, there was that PD-1, PD-L1, which was acting as a cloaking device, right? But sometimes that's not the way that tumors are evading the immune system. And so we asked the question, is there a way for us to help the immune system learn and see that tumor where before it hasn't been seen? That's where CAR T came into being, and other therapies like TCR therapies. These are therapies designed to actually work on the immune system itself, the T cells of the immune system, which is one of the types of immune cells in our body. Those cells are important for recognizing the difference between self and foreign. And again, we want the immune system to recognize the cancer as foreign. So what scientists have been doing is basically saying, well, we can analyze these tumors and see specific proteins, for example, on their surface, proteins like mesothelin or folate receptor. There's several of these. And by doing that, they can say, well, if the immune system could see this protein that's really only on the surface of the tumor cell and not really found much else in the body, well, then we could have a system for actually educating the immune system to attack the tumor. And so this is where these sorts of therapies were born. And the process is fairly complex. So in order to actually, go end to end, they're first taking cells, the normal immune cells, out of a patient. They're bringing them to the lab, sort of like you could consider it the university.
Are they drawing blood for that? Or are they drawing marrow or?
Yeah,
blood?
no, they're drawing it from the blood, and
Okay.
oftentimes it'll be done in something called an apheresis. If any of our watchers here have seen or have participated in platelet donation, it's the same sort of machine where basically it's circulating around the blood so you can draw out more of the white blood cells and these T cells. Once they have them, they'll bring them to the lab. And again, the lab is sort of like the university for these T cells. They're actually using viruses to teach the T cells which proteins to recognize that are back on that cancer, and then bringing it back to the patient when done without the virus, just those T cells now, and putting them back into the patient so that those T cells can now home in and attack the tumor. And and again, it sounds pretty complex. I think it actually is complex. It's quite expensive, and the world will deal with all of these things. But the miraculous part is that in leukemia, specifically ALL, acute lymphocytic leukemia, patients who had previously never responded to chemotherapy, never had achieved a remission. Now we're going into durable remissions where the cancer couldn't even be seen. These patients would then go on to a bone marrow transplant and be cured of their disease. And this is something that, again, had never been seen before. Those patients traditionally would have nothing left. And so that was pioneered by Carl June at the University of Pennsylvania and sort of has become a famous story in and of itself. But again, now the question is, well, where else can we put this sort of a therapy to make it work? Obviously works in ALL quite well. Now they're asking similar kind of questions in other liquid tumors and even crossing over into some solid tumors, things like multiple myeloma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There are certain subtypes of those that are now being treated today on clinical trials with this sort of TCR or CAR T therapy, and it's showing some pretty amazing results. I expect that in several years, those will likely become standard as well. And then finally, we're all looking and hoping for the day when we start to see its impact in solid tumors. Tumor types like ovarian cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer. Those have so far evaded and not shown to have as great of a benefit. Again, in sort of the version 1 and version 2 of these therapies. I think they're up to like version 4 now of how they're educating those T cells. And for the very first time, we're starting to see some positive data coming out of the prostate cancer world and the clinical trial being run in prostate cancer. And so, we were, these clinical trials are now multiplying. And I'd love to show you a little bit about a search that we were just doing last week for a patient with ovarian cancer, because we were asking the question, well, when this patient needs a new therapy, what sort of innovative therapies exist?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you were pulling that up, I'd say it's very clear that there's just more tools in the tool belt. That's kind of what we're moving towards, that, there is chemotherapy that has its place. There's radiation, there's surgery when possible. And then these are things that could come before or after some of the traditional treatments. And many of them are most likely going to be, without incurring cost, they're going to be available to you in clinical trials. I mean, it's something that is out there.
That's right. That's one of the benefits of the clinical trial, is that the company is basically paying for the drug to be given to the patient. And so the drugs, from the patient's perspective and from their healthcare insurance perspective, don't cost any money. There's still some charges in terms of the routine care that they'd be getting. But again, their insurance company is likely going to be taking care of that. And so for the cancer patient, these are opportunities to really get a hold of tomorrow's therapies today, and sometimes in a very powerful way. So let me share my screen here. Let me know if that is working. It seems like it's up.
Yeah, I can see that.
Great. And so, so this is the sort of options that we would pull out for a cancer patient. Again, we looked in this patient. We look in their geographical area, so the state that they live or even the city that they live in, and we're looking around that area. You'll see that this patient comes from sort of, the Washington, D.C. area, and so you'll see a lot of our options basically say, give us an approximation of how far these are, but this helps us to really pick therapies that we think are accessible to the patients, where they don't have to travel so far. And they may have to, but our preference is if they're available, and these tend to be distributed across the United States, then they don't have to travel so far. So, the names of these can often be quite confusing, but, and I won't even try to really say the name of the therapy. This one is abbreviated Gavocel, and is found in mesothelin expressing cancer. So from this, I can tell you that mesothelin is that protein on the cancer. That's the protein that the scientists have decided to try to target and tell the immune system to attack. And so they're doing it with these CAR T therapies. This one is abbreviated TC210T. And they do this in combination with other immunotherapy. So nivolumab is one of those PD-1 agents that we just recently talked about a few minutes ago. And then in addition to that, there is some chemotherapy that's being given to the patient to sort of prepare the way to allow these cells to get in and to get situated so that they can do what they need to do and attack the cancer. And you can see that there's not just one of these. This one is happening in Bethesda at the NIH, but there's actually several options, all in Bethesda, Maryland, at the NIH. And so, when we went through this, and there's different flavors of these. This one doesn't tell you the target that it's trying to say, although it looks like it may be for something related to the folate receptor or folate receptor alpha. Okay. There may be others that are targeting another protein called B7H3. Again, there's several options of these. Some of these are at the University of Pennsylvania. Here's one in North Carolina. But as we go through these are ones that we can check in on. We can find out if they're enrolling and who to contact at these centers. And this is how we will then be helping patients to find them.
Yeah, I mean, as anyone watching can see, I mean, some of these names are incredibly difficult to kind of traverse and kind of understand what these things are. So let me ask you, like, how would a patient with what the tumor is expressing seems important in these. So how would that testing be done? Is that also a blood test to find that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And no, it's actually not a blood test. In this case, they want to look at the tumor specifically to see that it has those proteins on it. So, if they did look at the blood, we may see the protein, we may not. Oftentimes these proteins, again, are designed to be specifically sort of lodged in the tumor. You don't want them floating around, so we wouldn't expect them to necessarily see them in the blood. So This is a test that is done on a piece of tumor. It can be done on a biopsy. Doesn't have to be a new biopsy. It can be the original biopsy or a previous surgical specimen. And yes, it does have to be ordered by the doctor or by the clinical trial center, and they can check to make sure that the protein is there. Now, we know from what scientists have done before, what's the likelihood? And so again, these trials oftentimes are working with proteins that we know are on the vast majority of cancer patients of let's say ovarian cancer in this case. And so from my perspective, the chances are better than 50% that it's going to be positive and that they're going to be a match. But sometimes the work has to be done just to verify and make sure that that's the case. That can take some time. And so usually it's something that we want, patients to get started on with earlier as opposed to later. In addition, I'll just mention that we talked about that education process in the lab, sort of the university for the T cells. That process can also take months. And so again, oftentimes it's when patients are on standard therapy that we want them to start looking at these innovative options so that they can get a jump start on preparing for next steps if and when they need it. If they never need it, fine. But again, with high-risk cancer, it's oftentimes not a question of whether the tumor will come back, but just when it will come back. And in time, these sorts of ideas are ready for them when needed.
Yeah, I just want to point out, onto that end, the beginning of this month marks the beginning of Pancreatic Awareness Month. And pancreatic cancer is one where it's not often caught early. It's often metastatic when found. And even when it is found local, it's just got a high rate of recurrence, like a very high rate of recurrence. So that's a situation that is very clear. Even if your doctor says, yeah, we're going to start you on this chemo and radiation right away, that's, you got to prepare. I know you didn't want to join this club, but now that you're in it, you really have to look to the future. And that's what, like, lining up clinical trials. And I think that's where we see people very successful, finding a durable benefit over time when they're very realistic that this treatment is going to be, for maybe some shrinkage, maybe some maintenance, and then this is a real attempt at a cure. And then if that doesn't work, that's not the end of the line. There's something else to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's part of our philosophy, is really to put a list of these, a short list, but certainly a list of viable options, and rank them based on the data that has been out there, for as long as it's out there for. Basically science, produces the information. How well are these working? How safe are these therapies? And if there's evidence to say that we know that is expected to give us some months or even years, then obviously those are going to go up to the top as long as they're safe, right? Ones that we know less about will go down to the bottom, but again, they're not off the list. And right. So at the right time, they're available. Actually, this brings us into another advancement that I wanted to talk about today, which is called antibody-drug conjugates, because this is yet a different type of therapy, but one that for ovarian cancer and other cancers, has really been shown to be quite effective, and is really, there's a lot. I just showed you 8 trials in this area for CAR T therapy. Well, there's 11 trials for antibody-drug conjugates. And it's something that I think we'll come back to over and over again, especially, as it is Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Month coming up. I could see doing a webinar specifically talking about new therapies and breakthroughs in pancreatic cancer, because, gosh, yes, it's certainly needed. And, we help quite a number of patients with pancreatic cancer find their way on to clinical trials and other innovative approaches. So, so I can tell you a little bit about the antibody-drug conjugate field and show you an example.
I know nothing about that.
Yeah. And most patients wouldn't. Most patients know chemotherapy. And what's interestingly is, we've talked about the immune system and how it can home into a tumor. We've talked about in previous webinars, chemotherapy, which is just small drugs that sort of float around the body and they get into cells and they cause those cells to stop dividing. Now, sometimes when it's the cancer, that could be quite beneficial. But when it's other cells, like your gut cells or maybe your bone marrow cells, which need to produce white blood cells, it's not so good. And so that's why patients will have neutropenia. They'll have low white blood cell counts while they're getting chemotherapy. So what if we could actually put those two together? And that's how antibody-drug conjugates were born. The antibody piece is produced by the immune system, and it is the sort of the action end of T cells and other B cells that go and home in on cancer and their proteins. So here is it's a antibody, which is a protein itself. So you don't need any cells for this. It's a purified protein produced in the lab that's going to be like a heat-seeking missile and find that protein on the tumor surface. Again, we know, most of the time if the protein is likely to be there, and we can find out specifically by testing the patient's tumor. This antibody isn't just alone, and there are drugs where the antibody is just a single antibody, things like Herceptin, which can be quite effective in HER2-positive breast cancer as an antibody. But in this case, antibody-drug conjugates, you're actually taking one of those chemotherapy drugs and one that's really, really potent. So you wouldn't want to just inject this without sort of an antibody to guide it. But what they're doing is they're attaching it with something called a chemical linker, which is just what it sounds like. It's a chemical bond between the chemotherapy, the drug, and that antibody. And then they're putting this into people, and the antibody goes and finds the tumor protein attaches, the chemotherapy then gets inside those cells, does its job, and effectively kills the cancer cells. It does still cause some side effects for the patient, but what we're seeing in the last year is about 8 of these have now been newly approved. For a while, we had seen 2 of them get approved, but it was a pretty long time to really start figuring out how to use these effectively to start treating patients. But the good news is now more and more of these are coming down the pike. And as I said, for this patient that we were looking at with ovarian cancer, we saw something like 11 of them right in her sort of geographical area. Again, when needed, they would be accessible for her. And unlike some of the fancier sort of, futuristic CAR T therapies, we have more data on these ADCs. So we already are starting to see that they're working for months, some of them 6 months, some of them 9 months or 12 months, some of them 3 months. So again, we can start to sort these out and say, okay, based on what your tumor has, the protein that it's having, and what we see in terms of the data, we might recommend your doctor consider sending you to, or you getting a second opinion at a specific cancer center that offers this therapy, and asking them, is it reasonable to consider? Is this good for you? And 90% of the time, the answer we're hearing is yes. And so, we do think that that's how we work, and that's how we get patients to get access to these therapies.
I see the excitement. I mean, chemo has kind of been understood that it kills cancer cells, but, it kills regular cells, and just hopefully it kills more cancer cells than regular cells. And I think the idea of that being a more targeted, like using what it is good for in a targeted way, is just, that's incredible. Is that given? How is that generally given? Is that kind of like given like chemo, like you're going to show up every week for a period of time, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, it can vary based on how long it's expected to be around. The idea is that we're sort of, creating a system where the tumor is going to be, having drug around it as much as we can for as long as we can. That being said, these antibodies generally last in the body for about 3 weeks. And so it falls out to around an every 3-week repeated administration for these antibody-drug conjugates. Again, some of them are shorter if they last less long. Some of them could be longer. It could be a month or even 6 weeks. And generally somewhere in that sort of, 2 to 6 week period is as frequently as they're given, but most of them we see are being given on an every 3 week schedule intravenously. So this is given through the vein, sort of, system wide, and the protein itself is the heat seeking sort of pathway to finding the tumor.
Gotcha. Okay. So, that's great. I want to turn over because we had a question I want to make sure that we get to. We had a question from a patient who has metastatic breast cancer, HER negative and PR positive. And she was curious, what are there immunotherapies that would be available for me? So I kind of want to turn that over to you. I think, talk as specifically or generally as you like. But I don't think you have to stick to immunotherapies when we talk about like what is out there for her. And as I understand it, she is on a treatment that is, doing okay. They feel like there's some response. So she's looking down the line. She kind of understands even a good response here isn't going to keep her from maybe needing something later on. So that's why that was the source of her question.
Yeah. And frankly, I applaud her and patients like her for doing exactly what she's doing. This is sort of the people who we work best with because they are looking ahead. They are proactive. And at the same time, they may be enjoying a period of time, a relative sort of stability where the therapy is working, regardless of whether that's first line or second line standard care or something else that patient may be on. And again, in estrogen positive breast cancer, there are the hormonal blockers like the aromatase inhibitors, letrozole, and others like this, fulvestrant, that can really help to create some of that stability. But it's an important question to ask. And again, the world, it's been rapidly changing. Just a few years ago, an immunotherapy was approved in triple negative breast cancer, which is one that is ER negative, as well as being PR negative and HER2 negative. But that was an important breakthrough because prior to that, the only thing available for those patients was chemotherapy. And so it's a really good question that she's asking, which is, well, it's approved over in triple negative. Does it work in ER positive? My guess would be yes, it's likely to work. But who's working on this? How far are they at showing these? These are all really good questions. And that's the sort of questions that we ourselves are asking on the behalf of patients all the time. So, I'm excited to show you sort of our process and what we do because, again, we've built a system to provide those answers to us directly. And so, as I'll share my screen again here, and I've sort of front loaded our system with the information that we had about this patient, things like what is the stage of the cancer? What is the cancer type, being breast cancer? Is it ER positive? Is it HER2 positive? And other questions like this. Has it been treated before? And so knowing, and then finally, where does the patient live? Knowing these things can really help us to zoom in fairly quickly. And so, again, not knowing exactly where the patient lives, I looked at sort of, countrywide, but made it very specific because, again, some of the therapies don't say ER anything. It could be ER positive, it could be ER negative. But I zoomed in on those that actually specifically said ER positive. And what I found, and I applied a filter that we've built to look at immunotherapies. And what I found came up with some interesting results. Here's a trial, the first one that sort of came up in our system. And again, this is something that, is combining radiation with immunotherapy. That immunotherapy is the PD-1 therapy that we talked about before, pembrolizumab, the one that's been really effective in melanoma. And this is for patients with unresectable metastatic, which is stage 4 breast cancer. And they added a name to the trial called Twisted Pink. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an advocacy group somewhere in supporting this, given that name. Here's another trial, and this one really caught my eye because it involves this drug called sacituzumab. And remember, we just talked about antibody-drug conjugates. Well, I recognize that this is one of them. This is an antibody-drug conjugate. And, if I didn't know, our system actually tells us it's an ADC, antibody-drug conjugate. And again, it's being combined with that PD-1 blocker pembrolizumab. And this is specifically in hormone receptor, estrogen receptor positive, HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer. So if I were a patient like this patient, this is a pretty exciting combination because not only do you get the immunotherapy, but you also get some really novel and innovative targeted therapy in terms of that antibody-drug conjugate, and the two of them are being combined together. And, the trials go on. I pulled out 8 across the country that are being run today. But what's fascinating is, we can go and very quickly now go across and take a look at, sort of where these trials are. And again, we focus on the United States, and we can dive into any location that the patient may be. If you were in New York, we could see that there's 5 trials near that patient. In the Chicago area, we can see there's 2 trials over there. But there's a lot of trials situated across the United States. So, for example, if this patient was in, Raleigh, North Carolina, then this is a trial that we would say, we can find for you.
Yeah.
And this is actually that same trial that we were just talking about that I rank sort of at the top of my interest. And so, this is the way that we work. And what we would do from here is take a look to see who is actually running this trial, which doctor has it in their hands. And that's the information that we then go and tell the patient about so that they can go request a second opinion or an opinion from that specific doctor. We give them a piece of paper, a report that they can present that basically asks the questions for them to that doctor to say, hey, is this right for me? Is this reasonable to consider? And if so, when? And again, they may want to test to make sure that protein is on the tumor surface. So maybe it'll take some time to figure it out. Or maybe it's for all patients because we know it's in the vast majority of breast cancer patients. So again, these are the details that matter. But to me, it's a process that starts with really apprising the patient of what innovative therapies are out there and getting them to those centers that provide them.
That's great. I think we've answered a resounding yes. There are immunotherapies available for this given patient situation, and I would just say that almost every patient that we've ever come across, we've been able to find something that is a match for them. Jason was just showing, a map, and that's just specific to that search that he was doing. I mean, there are 13,000 trials. Many of those trials have multiple locations. So we're talking tens of thousands of different places in the United States where trials are available and running. And so for your given situation, whatever it is, there is probably something out there. But you can see from our conversation today, it is hard to figure out. It's hard to know. And that's kind of one of the reasons that we are here to help patients to basically look at all the research, look at all the references, what's out there, what's exciting, what's happening, and what has a high likelihood of having a positive effect for a patient.
Yeah. And we see so many families with relatives who, feel so unfortunate that their loved one has been diagnosed with cancer, feel powerless and really just sort of, without any hope or options of what to do for them. And here's something that, we want to actively provide people and their loved ones with this information so that they know what to do to really effectively help. And, again, we've been doing this for 8 years now. It's going really well. Our patients do much better on average compared to what you would expect otherwise. 2 years of longevity and more, oftentimes with good lifestyles. So, again, this is why we do what we do. This is our mission, to bring this to as many people as possible.
Excellent. Well, that's a great place to end it. Once again, I just want to remind everyone we are Sagely Health. You can find us online at sagelyhealth.com. And if you have any questions, anything we can help with, please do reach out.
Thank you so much.
We'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Bye-bye.